Crayons scattered across the hospital floor as my little girl looked up at the woman in the bed and said, "My dad's a hero, but he's lonely too." I froze where I stood, sleeves still rolled from the transfusion, not sure if she'd even heard. But Victoria's eyes lingered on me in a way no one else's ever had. The hospital corridors reeked of antiseptic, but beneath the sterile scent was something heavier, something that clung to the skin: fear. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting their cold glow across walls lined with family members waiting for news they dreaded. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, their footsteps echoing like drumbeats in a march, their clipped voices low but urgent, whispering words no one wanted to hear. Inside one of the ICU rooms lay Victoria Hale. To the world, she was untouchable, the iron-willed CEO of one of the largest tech empires on the planet, a woman who had bent markets and entire industries to her will. But here, surrounded by machines that beeped with cold indifference, she was no titan of industry. She was just a woman whose body was failing her. Her chest rose shallowly, monitors flashing alarms more often than steady signals. Specialists had flown in from London, New York, even Switzerland, each armed with credentials and promises. Experimental treatments worth millions had already coursed through her veins. Yet her skin was pale, her lips colorless, her pulse faint. Money and power had bought her everything in life, but they were useless currency against death. Her family sat outside the ICU, their faces drained. Some buried themselves in their phones, seeking distraction. Others stared blankly at the floor, too tired to cry anymore. They had been clinging to hope for days, but tonight, even hope seemed to be abandoning them. A few hallways away, in a quieter waiting room, sat Ethan Cole. He wore an old flannel shirt and faded jeans, clothes that carried the wear of a man who didn't think about appearances, only practicality. His daughter Lily leaned against him, her small hand wrapped tightly around his larger one. Her hazel eyes, wide with trust and innocence, kept flicking toward him as if she could read the tension in his body. She was only 8, still carrying the unshaken belief that her father could keep the world safe. Ethan had been to battlefields before, seen men shattered in ways that no medicine could mend. Yet nothing ever rattled him the way the thought of his little girl falling sick did. Tonight, thankfully, she wasn't. They were just here for a routine checkup, a simple appointment. Nothing more. But life had a way of dragging people into stories they never expected to be part of. The door at the far end of the hall swung open with a sharp bang, and a nurse hurried through, her voice rising as she spoke into a headset. Ethan wasn't trying to listen, but some words carried weight that couldn't be ignored. "She doesn't have much time. None of the transfusions are working. Her body keeps rejecting everything." Ethan's instincts, honed in war, sharpened as a father, made him tense. His grip on Lily's hand tightened. "Daddy." Lily's small voice pulled his attention down to her. She tilted her head, searching his face. "What's wrong?" He forced a smile, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just someone very sick." But even as he reassured her, his ears caught another desperate phrase from the nurse as she vanished down the corridor. "She needs a rare antigen. If we don't find a match, she won't last the night." Ethan leaned back against the stiff plastic chair, his jaw tightening. He knew that feeling, when life slipped through your fingers, when seconds decided everything. He had seen comrades bleed out in dust and sand while medics shouted for miracles that never came. And here, in this clean, polished hospital, the same helpless battle was being fought. Lily tugged his arm again. "Can't the doctors help her?" Ethan looked at her, her eyes filled with the kind of compassion only a child could hold for a stranger she had never met. He swallowed hard. "They're trying, Lily. They're trying as hard as they can." But inside, he felt the weight of something pressing down, the sense that this night was about to demand something of him. The announcement came over the intercom, sharp and urgent. "Attention! Emergency donors needed. Rare antigen. Report to blood bank immediately." The nurse Ethan had overheard moments ago appeared again, this time with a clipboard in one hand and a face taut with desperation. Her voice carried down the hall. "We need volunteers for a critical transfusion. Please, if you've donated before or are willing, come now." Ethan was already on his feet before he realized it. Lily blinked up at him, startled by the sudden movement. "Daddy, where are you going?" she asked, clutching his sleeve. He knelt in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sweetheart, someone's very sick, and they need help. I might be able to do something. Will you sit right here and wait for me?" Her lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. "You'll come back, right?" He gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Always." When he straightened, he walked with the steady stride of a soldier moving toward a fight. Not loud, not flashy, but inevitable. The nurse looked up as he approached. "I'll give," Ethan said simply. She paused, scanning him. His build was strong, weathered by years of service, but she shook her head. "Sir, you don't understand. We've tested dozens already tonight. The odds of a compatible antigen are next to impossible. Try me," Ethan replied, rolling up his sleeve before she could argue. Her pen froze halfway down the page, her eyes widening slightly at the certainty in his voice. "You don't even know who the patient is." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Doesn't matter." Minutes later, he sat in a small, sterile room while a technician prepped his arm. The sting of the needle was nothing compared to the battles he had endured. Still, as his blood filled the first vial, he thought of Lily sitting alone in the waiting room. He could picture her swinging her feet nervously, hugging her backpack to her chest. The urge to protect her clashed with the pull of duty thrumming through his veins. "What am I doing?" he asked himself. "This isn't my fight. I don't know these people anything." But he knew that wasn't true. On the battlefield, he had sworn to himself that if he ever had the chance to give life instead of taking it, he would do so without hesitation. The door opened, and the attending physician, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, entered with the nurse. They looked at the preliminary results, then back at Ethan as though trying to decide whether they dared believe them. "Run it again," the doctor ordered sharply. The technician frowned. "I already did. Twice. It's clean. Perfect compatibility." The nurse's lips parted in disbelief. "He's the only one." Ethan glanced between them. "So I can help?" The doctor's composure cracked for the first time that night, his voice carrying something close to relief. "You can do more than help, Mr. Cole." "Ethan Cole." "Well, Mr. Cole," the doctor said, almost reverently, "your blood may be the only thing standing between her and death tonight." They wasted no time. Within the hour, Ethan was lying on a hospital bed, and 4-line connecting him to a patient he had never seen. He could hear the faint alarms from the ICU room next door, the rise and fall of medical orders, the urgency of machines pushing the boundary between life and death. He didn't need to see her to know that every drop of his blood carried weight far beyond himself. As the transfusion began, the monitors that had been flatlining slowly steadied. The shrill alarms softened into steady, rhythmic beeps. A murmur of disbelief spread among the doctors gathered inside the ICU. Some of them leaned forward, staring at the screens as though they had just witnessed the impossible. The nurse who had doubted him stepped out into the hallway, her eyes meeting Ethan's across the distance. She gave the smallest nod, part gratitude, part awe. Ethan leaned back against the pillow, exhaling a long, slow breath. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to believe it. He had been meant to be here. The ICU had been a battlefield of its own just hours earlier. Alarms shrieking, doctors scrambling, machines fighting a losing war against the inevitable. Now, the room was quieter, steadier. The monitors beeped in measured rhythm, and though the air still carried the metallic tang of medical equipment, the storm had passed. On the bed lay Victoria Hale. Her once sharply defined features, the face that had stared down boardrooms and silenced rivals, looked softer now, drained of power and pride. Her hair clung damp to her temples. Her lips were pale, but her chest rose with steadier breaths. For the first time in days, her body wasn't rejecting life. When her eyes fluttered open, the light was blinding. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the sterile glow above her. At first she thought she was alone, trapped again in the endless cycle of drugs and failed treatments. But then her gaze drifted, and she saw him. In the corner, sitting stiffly on a chair too small for his frame, was a man she didn't know. His posture was weary but steady, like someone who had learned to wait out storms without complaint. Across his lap, curled into the safety of his arms, was a little girl with chestnut hair. The child's head rested against his shoulder, her small mouth parted in sleep. The man brushed her hair back absently, the gesture tender, practiced. Victoria's throat was dry, but her voice, fragile as cracked glass, escaped. You? Ethan stirred, his eyes lifting from his daughter to the patient in the bed. He hadn't expected her to be awake, not yet. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low so as not to wake Lily. You're safe. You're stable now. She tried to form another question, but her lips trembled before the word could fully leave. You saved me. He shifted uncomfortably, not used to being placed in the center of anything. I just did what needed to be done. His gaze dropped, as though he could shrug off the weight of what he'd given. Her lips curved faintly, an expression foreign to her in boardrooms, but strangely natural here. You'd be surprised, she whispered, her voice weak but laced with something raw. Not everyone would. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady hum of machines. Victoria studied him, the worn flannel shirt, the boots scuffed with years of use, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of battles fought far beyond this hospital. He didn't fit here, among marble walls and polished shoes, and yet somehow he belonged more than anyone else. Ethan adjusted Lily in his arms, the girl sighing softly in her sleep. He glanced back at the woman in the bed, her eyes heavy but still locked on him. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't look away. In that fragile moment, surrounded by antiseptic, by silence, by the ghosts of death that had almost claimed her, something shifted. Victoria Hale, the billionaire who had lived her life insulated by contracts and walls of power, felt a thread of connection she hadn't known she craved. And Ethan Cole, the man who had come to the hospital for nothing more than his daughter's routine checkup, realized that his night had become entwined with a stranger's in a way that could never be undone. Days blurred into weeks. For the hospital staff, Victoria's recovery became a medical marvel, a case to be documented, studied, whispered about in conferences. But for Victoria herself, each day was less about charts and markers, and more about the man who walked past security checkpoints and polished marble floors carrying nothing but his daughter's backpack and his quiet courage. Every transfusion was a ritual. Ethan would arrive, his daughter Lily often skipping beside him with the energy only children could sustain in such a bleak place. The bodyguards posted near Victoria's suite always glanced at him with faint suspicion, as if unable to reconcile why this ordinary man had been allowed so far into their CEO's orbit. But the doctors waved him through, reverent in their own way, knowing that without him the miracle they were witnessing would unravel. Ethan never made a show of it. He would sit, roll up his sleeve, and let the medical team take what was needed. His expression was calm, almost detached, as if giving his blood was no more significant than lending someone a hand to stand up. But Victoria watched him, watched the steadiness in his eyes, the way he never flinched, the way he always looked first at Lily before looking at her. At first, their conversations were brief. She would ask, "How are you feeling?" in the polite tone of someone used to formalities. He would nod and answer, "Fine, strong." And then silence would settle again, broken only by the soft scratch of Lily's crayons as she colored in the corner. But the silences grew shorter. One afternoon, sunlight poured through the glass walls of her recovery suite, spilling warmth across the sterile floor. Victoria turned her head toward him, her voice softer than usual. "Why would you risk so much for a stranger?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved to Lily, who was sprawled on the carpet with markers scattered around her, drawing something that looked like a house with a crooked tree. He exhaled slowly. "Because I know what it's like to be helpless," he said. His voice carried weight, not loud, not emotional, but certain. "On the battlefield, I saw men save because someone gave without hesitation. No questions, no calculations. Just give. I promised myself I'd do the same, no matter who it was." Her throat tightened. In her world, every move was measured, every deal calculated for profit, for leverage. No one gave without asking for something in return. His words unsettled her, not because they were foreign, but because they were true. She studied him in silence. The war had carved lines into his face, but it hadn't hardened his spirit. Instead, it had given him something rare, a strength untainted by arrogance, a kindness that didn't seek recognition. The following days brought longer conversations. She asked about his service, and though he spoke with restraint, he told her enough for her to glimpse the shadows he carried. He asked about her company, not with awe but with curiosity, as though she were simply another person with a job, not the head of a billion-dollar empire. He asked if she had eaten, if she had slept, if she had smiled that day. No board member had ever cared for those answers. And she found herself waiting for his visits, not just because her survival depended on him, but because he treated her as if she were human first, CEO second. One evening, as the skyline blushed with sunset beyond the glass walls, Victoria caught herself smiling at something Lily said. The child had been describing a drawing in dramatic detail, waving her crayon like a wand. When Victoria glanced sideways, she saw Ethan watching her, not with admiration, not with pity, but with quiet acknowledgement, as though he saw past her defenses to the woman she rarely allowed the world to see. For years, Victoria Hale had convinced herself she didn't need anyone. Work had been her shield, success her armor. But now, tethered by transfusions to a man who had nothing but his daughter, she began to sense the faintest fracture in that armor. Not a weakness, but a possibility. The final rounds of transfusions came slower, less urgent now. Victoria was stronger. Her color had returned, her voice steadier, though her doctors still insisted on careful monitoring. Yet with each visit, Ethan continued to come, never asking how much longer, never pressing for when it would end. He came because he said he would, and that was enough. Lily had grown comfortable in Victoria's room. What had once been a sterile suite now bore traces of her presence. Crayon drawings taped discreetly near the bedside, a half-empty juice box on the side table, the faint hum of her humming as she colored. To Victoria, it was strangely disarming. She had spent years surrounded by glass walls, polished tables, and people who addressed her with careful calculation. Now a child sprawled on the hospital floor in mismatched socks, kicking her feet while scribbling rainbows across paper, and it made the room feel alive. One afternoon, after another transfusion ended, Victoria leaned forward, her body still fragile but her spirit curious. She knelt beside Lily, who was focused on a drawing of three stick figures standing in front of a crooked little house. "You know," Victoria said softly, "your dad is a hero." Lily looked up, her hazel eyes sparkling with a grin too big for her small face. "I know." She paused, then added with the blunt honesty of children, "But he's lonely too." The words hit harder than Victoria expected. She sat back slightly, as if the child's voice had carried the weight of something unspoken, something that Ethan himself would never confess. "Lonely," she repeated, her voice careful. Lily nodded matter-of-factly, returning to her drawing as if she had said nothing extraordinary. "He smiles at me a lot, but not at other people. Sometimes I hear him when he thinks I'm asleep. He talks to Mom's picture. I think he misses her." Victoria glanced toward Ethan. He was across the room, rolling down his sleeve after another transfusion, his movements steady, his expression unreadable. He hadn't heard. Or maybe he had, and his silence was his answer. Something in Victoria stirred, an ache she hadn't let herself feel in years. She had buried her own loneliness beneath endless work, convincing herself she didn't need companionship, didn't need family, didn't need love. But this man, who had given her life without asking for anything, carried his grief quietly, with dignity. And his daughter, with the innocent clarity only children possessed, had peeled back the truth in seconds. Victoria reached out and touched Lily's hand lightly. "You're very brave, you know that?" she whispered. Lily shrugged, as though bravery was nothing more than telling the truth. "Daddy says being brave is just doing the right thing, even when you're scared." The words lingered in the air, simple yet profound. Victoria turned her gaze back to Ethan. For the first time, she didn't just see a soldier or a savior. She saw a man who had given everything to protect his daughter, who carried his scars quietly, who didn't know he was still bleeding in ways no transfusion could heal. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt a pull, not of obligation, not of gratitude, but of something deeply human. The day of the press conference arrived like a storm gathering on the horizon. Outside the hospital, cameras lined the sidewalks, their lenses like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Journalists jostled for position, microphones raised, voices colliding into a chaotic hum. Victoria Hale's recovery had already become international news, whispered in boardrooms, splashed across headlines. Everyone expected her first public words to be about breakthroughs in medicine, corporate investment, or the triumph of technology. Inside the atrium, reporters filled every seat. The marble floors gleamed under the harsh lights, reflecting a world of power and prestige. Security stood at attention near the exits. The podium bore the crest of her company, a subtle reminder of the empire she ruled. Victoria walked slowly to the stage, thinner than before, her frame still fragile but her presence unshaken. Her tailored suit hung a little looser than it once had, yet she carried herself with the same composure that had silenced entire markets. The room quieted instantly, every camera flashing as though trying to capture proof that she truly stood alive before them. She began with steady words, thanking the hospital, the medical staff, and the tireless specialists who had flown in from across the globe. Her voice carried the crisp cadence of a leader accustomed to commanding attention. But as she spoke, her eyes moved past the crowd, toward the back of the room. There, almost blending into the shadows, sat Ethan. He wore no suit, no polished shoes, just a clean shirt, plain trousers, and his daughter sitting beside him, her feet swinging off the chair. His posture was relaxed, but his presence was undeniable, rooted, steady, unpretentious. Victoria's tone shifted. The words on her prepared speech seemed to fall away. She set the papers aside, gripping the podium more firmly. "I was saved," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the room lean closer. "Not by wealth, not by power, not even by medicine alone." She paused, letting the silence gather. "I was saved by selflessness, by a man who gave when he didn't have to, a man who had nothing to gain and everything to risk. That is what real strength looks like." The room fell utterly silent. Reporters who had come prepared to jot down figures and sound bites now stared, unsure how to frame what they were hearing. The cameras flashed again, but this time with a different urgency, not to capture a corporate icon, but a woman speaking of something raw, something human. Victoria's eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. For a moment, it felt as though the entire crowd had vanished, leaving only the three of them. Her, the man who had given his blood, and the child who had carried more truth in her small words than any boardroom speech ever had. Lily nudged her father and whispered loudly enough for him to blush. "She's talking about you, Daddy." Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head, uncomfortable with the spotlight even from the shadows. But Victoria caught the gesture, and her lips curved faintly into a smile that wasn't for the cameras. It was for him. When the conference ended, the applause came late, hesitant at first, then swelling into thunder as people stood, moved not by a corporate victory, but by the rare glimpse of humility from a woman once thought untouchable. Reporters would write their stories. Headlines would scream, "Veteran's blood saves billionaire CEO." But what none of them could capture was the bond forming quietly, unseen, between two broken souls who had found one another in the unlikeliest of ways. The press conference ended, but the echoes of Victoria's words lingered long after the cameras were packed away and the reporters spilled out onto the street. The hospital atrium emptied, leaving behind silence that felt heavier than applause. For the first time in weeks, Victoria wasn't surrounded by staff or family or flashing lights. She was alone, with her thoughts, and with a clarity that had eluded her through years of board meetings and contracts. She didn't return to her suite right away. Instead, she walked, slowly, her body still remembering the weight of weakness, down the quieter corridors. Her heels tapped softly against the tile, the sound measured, deliberate. She turned a corner and stopped. There he was. Ethan stood by a vending machine, one hand resting on Lily's shoulder as she punched the buttons, choosing a snack with the gravity of a general selecting a strategy. The fluorescent lights above them flickered faintly, casting a glow that seemed far removed from the grandeur of her world. He looked utterly ordinary. And yet, she knew, ordinary was a lie. She approached, her steps lighter now. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze with that same steady calm, as if saving her life hadn't changed who he was at all. "You gave me life back," she said quietly, her voice carrying more weight in the empty hall than it had on any stage. "Maybe I can give you something too." He raised a brow, cautious. "And what's that?" Her lips curved into something rare, something unpracticed, a real smile, not the polished expression she had perfected over decades of leadership. "A future, if you'll let me." For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan's composure faltered. He studied her face, as though searching for hidden motives, as though testing whether her words carried the same honesty as his actions always had. Lily tugged at his sleeve, her small voice piping up between them. "Daddy," she said with the certainty only a child could carry. "I think she means it." Victoria crouched down so she was at Lily's eye level, ignoring the pull in her still healing body. "I do mean it," she whispered. "Your dad is the bravest man I've ever known. And if he's willing, I'd like to stand beside him. With both of you." Lily's eyes widened, her grin blooming like sunlight. She looked back at her father, who remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Ethan exhaled, a sound more like surrender than hesitation, not to weakness, but to the possibility of something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. "Maybe," he said softly, "we can try." Months later, the headlines had shifted again, from battlefield to boardroom. The single dad who won the CEO's heart. But for Ethan and Victoria, headlines didn't matter. What mattered were the evenings at the dinner table, where laughter replaced silence. What mattered was Lily teaching Victoria how to bake cookies, flour dusting the counters as though they had declared war on neatness. What mattered were the small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary simply because they were shared. For years, Victoria had believed healing could only come through control, through wealth, through power. Ethan had believed his wounds would remain scars, quiet and unseen, born for Lily's sake alone. But together, they learned a different truth. Sometimes the greatest cures aren't found in medicine or money. They're found in kindness, in courage, in hearts willing to give without asking for anything in return. And in that truth, they found not just survival, but a family.